So without wasting much of our time, we'll be moving on to the next segment of this conference. We'll be moving to the fourth and final session, and the session will be presented by Professor Remi, the head of department of the Department of Political Science, University of Ibadan. And before he starts his presentation, I'm going to call on Mr. Daniel Adiola, who would be reading the citation of our presenter, and afterwards we would move into the presentation proper. Daniel, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be reading the citation of Professor Emmanuel Remi Aiyede. Emmanuel Remi Aiyede is a professor of political institutions, governance, and public policy at the Department of Political Science, University of Ibadan. He's a fellow of the Pan-African Scientific Research Council and the current head department of political science, a former sub-dean, faculty of the social sciences, and a former coordinator of the leadership and governance program from 2010 to 2014. Center for Sustainable Development, University of Ibadan. He was also a visiting scholar at the Electoral Institute, Independent National Electoral Commission, Abuja, 2016 to 2017. Visiting fellow at the Transregional Center for Democratic Studies, CCDS, New School University in New York, 2000, and a fellow at the Governance Unit think tank in Ibadan in 1998 to 2004. Professor Aiyede, who holds a PhD degree in political science from the University of Ibadan, is an alumnus of the Fulbright study of the United States Institute of National Security Policy after 9/11, University of Delaware, 2009, Executive Education Program on Governance at the Albert Kennedy School, 2008, and the Partnership for African Social Governance Research, ApexGuide, training program on pedagogical methods for teaching public policy and e-case development, Nairobi, 2000 to 2014. He taught at the University of Lagos before joining the University of Ibadan in 2005. He has experience in several universities within and outside Africa as visiting lecturer. He has been on the editorial board of the Nigerian oldest surviving newspaper, the New Nigerian Tribune, since 2008. He contributes to the public discourse in the Nigerian domestic and foreign media. His research work connects public policy, institutional reforms, and democratic institution building. Maintaining close contact with the policy process, he has participated in building the governance and policy capacities of national and state executive officials and legislatures in Nigeria. He has been involved with PASGA in promoting innovative pedagogy in higher education in Africa. He was a part of the team that developed the curriculum for the Masters of Research and Public Policy and a PhD program in public policy, which currently run in universities across Africa in 2020. His recent publications include Remi Aiyede and O.M. Quadri 2002, Public Evaluation in African, in Gideon Onyangon, Routledge Book of Public Policy in Africa, London, Routledge, Taylor and Francis, page 164 to 1676, Nicholas Awoti and Remi Aiyede 2017 Politics, Public Policy and Social Protection in Africa, Evidence from Cash Transfer Program, London, Routledge. His article, The Dynamics of Civil Society in the Democratization Process in Nigeria, Canadian Journal of African Studies, 2003, won a 2003 medal in the World Prize for Outstanding Research in Development of the Global Development Network, GDN. I present to you Professor Remi Aiyede as he take over our next session. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Morning, sir.
Morning, sir.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I was here yesterday and listened to the presentation by Femi Adenitan, something, who was a student here in the Faculty of Law. I remember in those days when he was involved with a number of activities, I used to write a reference for him. And I was also there to listen to part of Professor Pogosin's presentation, but unfortunately, I had to leave. And then this morning, I had to rush for my program at the 32 FM studio before coming here. That's why I was a little bit late, only able to listen to the closing remark of Dr. Lafenwa. I have an idea what I wanted to talk about, and it was supposed to be just for me to share a particular slide. I'll try to see if I can put it up, which is a picture that depicts your idea that I want to talk about, which is breaking the barriers to inclusive governance, the role of responsible citizenship in inclusive governance. I think something is missing in this title, but I have my presentation broken down into a number of sessions, which I'm going to be talking about accordingly. I will look first at the entire issue of inclusive governance and how it is problematized in the context of Nigeria, because although Nigeria is not written on the topic, from the discussion so far, apparently, to me, the focus is on Nigeria. And to do that, I'll begin by looking at how the issue of inclusion is currently being debated in the country. And one of the departing points that one can take off from will be the current discussion of the Muslim ticket for the vice presidency of Nigeria, and the whole idea that is part of a systematic program of disempowering and underrepresenting the Christian group within the Nigerian political space. And there has been a lot of reaction and counter-reaction in that regard. If you want to see my take on that, I think I will put a link there. There's a recent article that I wrote, which was published in the Cable and in Intervention and a few other media outlets. It's titled Beyond Elite Political Consensus or Political Settlement between individual political ambition and elite political settlement, something like that. I'll put the link and then we can look at it. But it's actually my take on the current debate within an institutionalist perspective. But essentially, it's about the idea of inclusion and the barriers that we need to cross. And now we have attempted to cross it in the past. So what I'm going to look at first, I'll look at the notion of barriers to inclusive governance. What does that really mean? What are the barriers and how can we break them? Then secondly, I'm going to look at the idea of responsible citizenship. What is citizenship? And how does that link to the idea of breaking the barriers of inclusive governance? And then, of course, I will draw some conclusions from the empirical situation in Nigeria and what can be done, to address that. First and foremost, what is inclusive governance? If we talk about inclusive governance, we are talking in terms of a governance arrangement in which we recognize our diversity, which means diversity is very central to the question of inclusion. Because if there are no differences, if there are no variation in the possibilities of representation, I won't be talking about inclusive governance. Inclusive governance, therefore, refers to a situation where the diverse groups, the diverse categories of our society is made to have a sense of belonging in the way governance is conducted, both in terms of representation in the offices and office of the state, and also in terms of enjoying what some people call the dividends of democracy, or what we call the services, that comes from the operation of the state. So we don't have a situation where the government is made up of only Muslims, for instance, or only Christians, or mostly Christians, or very few Muslims. And then we can look at that again in terms of the broader categories of ethnicity, terms of the various ethnic groups. And then we also look at that in terms of geopolitics, in terms of North versus South of the geopolitical zone, and so on and so forth. So that's the understanding of diversity and then inclusion. Now, what is responsible for the question of exclusive governance or lack of inclusion? We'll start first by looking at it. Sometimes it is historical in a country like Nigeria that is a colonial product. The process of colonialism accounts for a significant part of the way the state is constituted. So you have diversity of ethnic groups brought together to form one country. Secondly, the way these groups are brought together varies across time, and the manner in which they are incorporated into the governance structure of the colonial system also vary, and this is brought on into the post-colonial state. So you have a situation where the northern part of the country was largely ward of the influence of Western education, and you have the missionaries allowed to operate in most of the southern parts of the country, and therefore were exposed to Western education early, in colonial rule. And as a result of that, by the time we're approaching independence, a significant number of people were already not just graduate from secondary education, secondary schools, but even from universities, including postgraduate. Some of them have even gone overseas. So we have families that have generations already of graduates in higher education within the South. But in the North, one could count the number of people who have graduated from secondary school at the point of independence. And that created what we call some kind of group inequality, historical inequality. That means that there was some kind of discrimination, whether intentional or unintentional, between the North and South in terms of access to Western education. Now, even in the South and in other places where there was access to Western education, it was not even, because it depends on where the missionaries landed, in places like Lagos, in Benin City, in Abeokuta, and you can name a few places like Calabar. You find that the level of education in those places are relatively higher and better than in other places where Western education did not go deep into those communities. So that then means that there's kind of unlevel playing field due to this structural and historical problem. But more than that, inclusiveness is also, exclusion is also created by economic situations. Some people are also privileged to come from well-endowed families with high income. Others are from very low income. And if you put them on the table and say, go and compete, you have this problem where people cannot compete effectively because they are already disadvantaged from the families they come from the ethnic group they come from, or from the particular locality that they come from. And even over time at the individual level, you also still find the situation where poverty has increased over time. As we have said, Nigeria has become the poverty capital of the world. And people who are born into poverty tend to have this vicious circle of being, transferring their own poverty to their children. And if you don't really do anything to break that barrier, they will never really come out of that poverty situation. And that's where the whole idea of breaking the barrier comes. The question is, what kind of policies have been adopted to address this kind of situation? This time around, of course, we will recognize the fact that it is not a situation that is peculiar to Nigeria. It's something you find all over the world. The way this, what we call group inequality occurs may vary, but they are permanent, they are visible or strong in many countries of the world. If you go to India, for instance, they had their caste system that has created this kind of problem. If you go to the United States, the history of slavery and then the various ways through which people migrated into the United States to form the United States creates that kind of problem. And all over the world, it's difficult to get any society where inclusion is not a challenge. And a very vital part of this historical barrier is also the gender dimension, which we often talk about. And you'll find that women have been discriminated against for centuries in Europe, for instance. Until 1946, women did not have the right to vote in places like Britain. So you'll find that this whole question of exclusion, it's something that virtually all countries have to deal with. So the question then is, how have this problem of exclusion, or if you like, arising from what we call inequalities or inequities. Some people, in fact, if you want to look at it at the group level, we describe it as horizontal inequality. Now, the whole question of exclusion and the quest for removing the barriers of to inclusion is really because it has implications for stability, for peace, for conflict, and for social stability. In fact, there is a whole research that has looked into the causes of inequality, horizontal inequality, exclusion in governance, and the means through which all of this can be addressed. I think recently we did a paper, myself and Professor Aiyede, on horizontal ethnicity, horizontal inequality, and social development in Africa, where some of these challenges are carefully identified and outlined. And one of the studies is really that in many countries in Africa, the persistence of conflict and the inability to establish stability is likely accounted for by the presence of horizontal inequality, group inequality, in terms of representation in governance, in terms of economic representation, and in terms of poverty and social inequality. So when you put all of this together, they say they may not necessarily lead to war or conflict, but their exploitation often leads to conflict. In fact, take for instance, they look at some of the studies look at a number of countries, and one of the things we find is that the countries that have very high diversity do not necessarily experience instability and conflict. We also find that the most homogeneous societies also are not necessarily prone to conflict. There is a difference, there is a variable that makes a difference. That is perception of the causes of inequality, not our perception of what constitute barriers to inclusive governance is often responsible. In fact, they said there are sometimes what are caused by those who are even overrepresented in government. But because they are made to believe that they are underrepresented, they can be so angry that they provoke conflict. So perception matters in terms of issues of inclusion, of exclusion, of underrepresentation, and so on and so forth. And that's why what is presented in the media, what is presented can be very critical. So perception matters when it comes to issues of inclusion. And when it also comes to breaking the barriers to inclusion, we must take that into account. And that's why citizenship, or for that matter, responsible citizenship, is very crucial. Again, because when we talk about citizenship, we are talking about citizenship as a form of identity. We are talking about citizenship as a legal status. We are talking about citizenship as some form of agency, political intervention, capacity to cause change or to cause change to happen. Now, when we talk about responsible citizenship, it brings even some additional complications to it. In Nigeria, of course, we have problems with citizenship because, again, we have multiple layers of citizenship, or sometimes we describe as bifurcated citizenship. What we refer to as there's a general citizenship that is guaranteed by law, which means we are all citizens as long as we are born into Nigeria, we are either married or we register or we naturalize. But that's not sufficient. We also have in this citizenship that is traced to what we call indigeneity, that somebody's ancestry is found to be located somewhere that is identified in a state in Nigeria. And if you have legal citizenship, but you are not indigenous to a particular community. If you live in that state for many years, you pay your tax there, do whatever you want to do there, people still think that you're not part of that state. And it's only recently now, with all this banditry and all of that, the governors are beginning to take residency importantly. Recently, the Edo State government has announced that there's going to be a resident permit. There's going to be some kind of identification for people who are residents of a particular state. And in trying to address those kind of security challenges, I think we'll begin, it's a pathway towards trying to define what citizenship should look like, so that we can actually know beyond indigeneity and settler. We know that people can cause trouble if you don't try to identify them, locate them. Depending on how it is handled, we might in fact be going towards trying to identify a fundamental problem associated with citizenship. But much more than that, what it means is also that it is citizens who become governors, citizens who become leaders in various layers. And if they are irresponsible as citizens, they can't just suddenly become responsible when they are leaders. And the tragedy of this question of responsible citizenship is with us. We have people in government, they manage the resources of their state or their locality as if the resources are supposed to be spent on people who are not related to them. So you have state governors who will take the money of the state and go on a jamboree. You are contesting for a presidential seat, you take the resources of the state, you are contributing 2 million, 300 million to the cost of your presidency when pensioners in your state have not been paid. So they are handling the state as if they are not part of the state. People living in those states are not members of their own community, which creates all kinds of challenges. So responsibility is crucial, not just for inclusive governance, but also for meaningful consolidation of the state system, whether at the national level, at the state level, or at the local government level. So we begin to see the problems of irresponsibility when people occupy those offices. But interestingly, the responsibility started with them as ordinary citizens. And irresponsible citizens have a particular attitude towards governance. They don't think that the common good is important. They are only concerned and driven by their own self-interest. If it doesn't work well for them, everybody else could die. It doesn't really matter. And that's why we talk about leaders who are insensitive, to the problems that we have. And that's why sometimes when things go wrong, somewhere that we think is not part of it's not in our part of Nigeria, we think it doesn't matter. Until when the thing comes close, that's when we begin to scream. All these are part of characteristics of irresponsible citizenship, because as responsible citizens, we must know that there are two dimensions to citizenship. There's the vertical citizenship, which is the relationship between the citizen and the government and the state. And then, of course, there's also the relationship among citizens, which is the horizontal citizen. So if something bad happens to your neighbor, because the armed robbers are not knocking on your door, you can just continue to sleep. It doesn't really matter. If they rob everybody and don't rob you, you're fine. That kind of attitude is also part of irresponsible citizenship. When people who don't care about their neighbors, who don't care about other citizens, find themselves in the seats of power, the tendency is that they are likely to promote exclusion within governance. Now, that's dealing with some of those issues at the theoretical level and discussing how they manifest in terms of empirical political theory. But in practical terms, there are actually barriers to inclusion. For instance, if people are disempowered, if you belong to the poverty class, chances are, one of the things I used to tell my students in class is that we are all privileged, those of us who are in the university. Some of them keep crying, oh, we can't pay school fees, it's difficult, or we can't live exactly the same way we want to live. But if you look at the percentage of Nigerians in the university and those who are unable to even think or dream about going to the university, you know that being in the university itself shows that you are elevated, at least to some level, within the order of things. Because we have just about 550,000 undergraduates in the entire country. So, I mean, how many, and the country has over 200 million people, and those 200, over 50% of those 200 people are below, are young people. And if we have only 550,000 in probably say about 100 or 70 million young people who are supposed to be in the university, you see the gap that we are talking about. So yes, some people are already disadvantaged. And to these days, you also have increasing disparity between those who go to public schools, secondary schools, primary schools, and go to private secondary or primary schools. And so when you get to the university, you'll find that, yeah, a lot of people who are in the university are privileged to have attended some private schools, and therefore are better positioned to pass JAM, or to, especially if you come to our own university here, where admission is really on merit. The only way you will be lucky to enter into the system is to go through the distance learning system, which is a little bit much more liberal than the regular student list. So to get into the University of Ibadan, for instance, if you are disadvantaged by your primary and secondary school education, it's going to be a tall order. You must be exceptionally gifted to be able to do so. So these are barriers to inclusion. So inclusion has to do with different levels: economic access, political access, and then social access. So if you don't have access to education, it's a big barrier for you. And then, of course, there's also the question of what kind of job you do, what chances of upward mobility do you have in society. If, for instance, it is said that, oh, we want to do not too young to run, we bring down the age of those who can contest, that's fine. But you will soon find that it's not just about the age. You must have a war chest to be able to do so. And that's why we have not too young to run big, but we have ended up with aspirants who are 75 years, 70 years and above for the presidency, because the kind of war chest you need to build to be able to, even vie for those offices is not a joking matter. And so you see in the APC, for instance, people have asked to produce 100 million, just to show interest in a primaries for which you don't have a guarantee of success. Now, you know what that 100 million would do if you put it into a department or any department at all, not to talk of if you put it into a social science or art department, what miracle is likely to be done if the money is used effectively. Then, of course, you also talk about representation, which is often what people look at when we talk about politics. But of course, when we talk about governance, it's more embracing. So if we talk about the political dimension, for instance, we say, okay, it's a Muslim ticket. So why a Muslim ticket? Then we say, okay, there's federal character principles that strive to make sure that everyone is included. Why, after so many years of federal character principle, we are still having a problem where the appointments are largely skewed in favor of the president's men? And if you go to, nepotism all over the place, and so on and so forth. And so people feel excluded. They think they don't have access, and they say, look, if we have our own state, we're likely to do better than this system where some group are perpetually dominating. And you hear cries of marginalization, you hear cries of less, self-determination, let's restructure the country, and so on and so forth. All of this as a result of, the feeling, the perception of exclusion from governance. Now, in terms of measures that have been taken, of course, I've referred to the federal character principle. In 1994-95 conference under Abacha, we had the geopolitical zone, and then we also have the rotation, and then, of course, the zoning principles. All of these are designed to address issues of political exclusion. And we've seen the challenges associated with that, because having a quota system creates its own problem. And then you also hear about the Beijing affirmative action principle, which is also part of something close to federal character, that the quota should be given to women, don't say 30% or or so, and it should be guaranteed, but you can see what has also happened with the practice in Nigeria. Now, in terms of economic exclusion, there are all kinds of measures that have been put in place. The government talks about, these days all over the world, not only in Nigeria, they talk about cash transfers. They say there are some people who, no matter how easy education is, even if you make it free, their children can't go to school because they have to work in order to be able to feed themselves. And we say, okay, give their parents money and ask them to release the children to go to school so they can be in school, or introduce feeding programs so that when they are away from home, they don't have to depend on their parents to get food to eat. So you provide those food. So all kinds of measures that you see across. And then of course, there are practical measures to ensure that you extend some of educational facilities to different communities, ensure they have good classrooms, they have teachers, they have all of those things. And then you also talk about extending social amenities to the nooks and crannies of society, whether it's water, health facilities. And today in Nigeria, we talk about primary health care being in every ward within the local government and so on. So these are measures that are put in place, to break the barriers to inclusion, because if people are not empowered, first and foremost, they don't have a voice. 2, they can't fight discrimination. 3, they can't express themselves and they can't participate in the political life of community. So the dimension towards breaking the barrier to inclusion is multiple. And then you also find that one very important barrier is also the kind of governance system that you practice, especially the electoral system. And so we have all kinds of changes that have gone on in the electoral system for a while. And the latest, of course, is the direct transmission of results to through from the polling unit directly to the portal of INEC, to avoid the capacity of strong people within the political parties to intervene between, when the results are collated at the polling units and when they go to the collation center before they get to the state or national level. There are all kinds of manipulation by those who have means. And today now we are talking about vote buying, because it's now difficult for strong men of the political parties to manipulate and write results regardless of what is coming from the polling unit. So you can see that the barriers to inclusion is, the problem of inclusion, first and foremost, is complex and complicated. It has political dimensions, it has economic dimensions, it has social dimension. And you can look at each of these dimensions in great detail. Then secondly, we also see that there are measures taken to address these barriers at the political, economic, and social level. And we see that government is very central to all of this, from affirmative action to social assistance program to the use of quota system, and then of course the idea of even spread of developmental programs and initiatives across. And then we also notice that this inclusion has different dimensions, from gender to individual social inequality to group inequality. So it's a whole complicated measures. And that these measures, of course, can be written down, can be adopted from anywhere from all over the world, but without responsible citizenship, we have them on paper. In their implementation, people ignore them. And so you have a situation where federal character principle is very clear. The president does just the minimum. He says every state must have a minister. Once they have a minister, it's enough time for you to have political appointees. You say it's on anything you like, you will do. That what is important to you is competency or giving results. And then you put people from all one dimension of the country in political office. At the end of the day, there are no results. And then you argue that you are not breaking any law. Now, that is the cross of responsibility as far as I'm concerned. And you find those kind of arguments even in the universities. We have not just the rules that make specific demands of those in office, but that rule is supposed to define a particular culture or tradition of governance, which is supposed to influence decisions that are made regarding inclusion in other spheres. So you don't need to have another law that says if you are to appoint senior special assistant to the governor, president or the governor, you must spread it across the state. You don't need it. Once the law has already said, okay, if you want a minister, you must take one from it. It means that if you are also appointing people, you must try to make sure that you also reflect the federal character. But people will argue that it is not in the law. You are not breaking any law, as if law is the beginning and end of life. Law is usually the minimum. The same thing we have in the university. You want to appoint a vice chancellor, we say, okay, somebody has met all the criteria. Even criteria that are not existing in the rule is the basis on which people are then mobilized. And in doing that mobilization, nothing is heard about the purpose of the university, the purpose of the state, the essence of governance. How can our appointments, our mobilization lead to the achievement of the purposes of the state, the purposes of the university? It's only when you have responsible citizenship that you can do that. People will say it's not only that they have not broken the law, they also, as long as they are not caught, they think that they are doing fine. I remember when I was in the article I wrote on in the cable that I was talking about, I was making the argument that look at the basis of the elite settlement of 1994, 1995. The whole idea is that the annulment of the June 12th, 1993 election demonstrated that some people have a stronger strength, power within the political process, and they seem to want to monopolize power at the national level. And then we say, look, let's use this principle. At first, they say, okay, it should be rotated among the six geopolitical zones. Until 1994-95, there's nothing like geopolitical zones in Nigeria. And the idea is that, okay, if it rotates between the north and south, when it comes to the north, they rotate among the six geopolitical zones. When it comes to the south, they rotate among the three geopolitical zones. And suddenly somebody says, it is his ambition to be president. So when it comes to the south, let it be survival of the fittest. If you have enough money, come to APC primary and buy as many votes as you can. And if you don't have enough money, that's your business. It has belonged to the south. We don't need to microzone it to anywhere. But if you look at the idea is that the South have had it, the Southwest have had it. It's the Southeast that have not had it. Now, somebody was telling me at an argument, I say, if they really want it so badly, they should have raised enough money to be able to do that. I say, tell me one state in the Southeast that can muzzle, that a governor can steal to stupor and get the kind of money that somebody from Lagos would get. Or look at the South and tell me any state in the Southeast that can muster the kind of money you can get from River State. It is not accidental that those in APC and PDP who are trying to undermine those principles have money bags. And where they come from determine a lot about how much money they are being able to muster. So if you say survival of the fittest, survival of the fittest sometimes go against the rule of natural justice. And that's why the rule of law is not designed for strong people. The basis of institutions and rule of law is to take care of the weak in society. And if you want to understand that, go back to John Rawls' theory of justice. Your argument about the social contract, that the essence of social contract is to take care of the weak. Because the strong can muzzle anybody out of the way and get his way. So anybody who belongs to a disadvantaged group should not promote any way of undermining the rule of law, because it is through law, through institutions, through traditions and cultural practices that society demonstrates its respect for inclusive governance. But if you say we should allow the principle of the survival of the fittest to rule and undermine and disregard institutions when it is not favorable to the strong, then the time will come, because great strength is not permanent. Those who are strong today will not be those who will be strong tomorrow. And what happens if you are, because in 1993, there was no money that could recover the mandate back to Abiola, in spite of the fact that he has wealth and resources. And we learned from that mistake, because the first time he tried to muzzle his way through, they told him that the presidency is not for the highest bidder in 1983. And then he went back and played his politics. He had resources. He went through the country. He managed even Muslim ticket at that time, because he was campaigning on the basis of farewell, bye-bye to poverty, of inclusion, of concern for ordinary people. He had his way. Even then, it was not sufficient. Those who had more strength to win the political system denied him of an electoral victory that he was supposed to have legitimately earned. By 1994-95, we said, no, this thing cannot continue. They introduced the power shift principle and the rotation principle. And regardless of what Obasanjo had, whether he had money or not, they brought him from prison and said, this thing must go to. Nobody said, let us, yes, if you go to the Southwest, since they have been disadvantaged. But even then, if they don't have anybody who is strong enough to take over power, that's their business. No, even the powerful not recognize that if they don't bend over backwards to accommodate the Southwest, there will be trouble. And so we have this principle. Now they've thrown all the principles. Even the PDP that had the principle in its constitution, throw away that principle, and Atiku is emerging as the presidential candidate. So how do you go from here? Because what they are telling us is that until we get to another crisis point, then we now go back again to the drawing board, when we already have a fine principle that says, let these things go around. And that's why the whole idea of zoning, the whole idea, which is a form of federal character, a form of affirmative action, is very important. Now, these principles, of course, have their own downside. I mean, if you look at the implementation of the federal character principle, for instance, some people will say, how is it that there's reverse discrimination? Because that's what affirmative action promote, the disadvantaged, the weak. So if you think that it is not important, check all over the world, even in the United States, even in Canada, they try all of this. In Malaysia, in India, because you need to, allow people to have access. But in doing that, we have to be very careful about how we design those policies and how we implement them. But what you find is that such fine policies in Nigeria have been abused. Federal character does not mean that there should be no merit. It is not antithetical to merit. But in Nigeria, you find that it seems as if once you say federal character, you should throw away merit. Then secondly, in many places, some of these principles are time-bound. What they call, they have what we call sunset principles, such that after we say, okay, we are going to use this rotation principle for a particular period of time. So if every part of the country has had access to this governmental position, we can again, let's go back to merit and then see how it works out. But many of these, our own federal character principle, rotation principle, zoning principle, don't have sunset clauses. So that's why it looks as if it's going to be there forever. And people who don't benefit from it tend to try to undermine it. And those who have ambition also tend to manipulate it, to suit their own ambition. So in other words, breaking the barriers of inclusion barriers to inclusive governance is a very challenging thing. The policy prescriptions are available. Many of them have been practiced in Nigeria, but designing them appropriately, implementing them with responsibility is actually what where we suffer a great deal of deficit. And then we're at a crossroad where exclusion has increased because one, poverty has increased, and because of that, commitment to the government has dwindled. Three, those who are in government, especially in the last 8 years, have not paid attention to political inclusion in a very serious and systematic manner, and therefore they have deepened the feeling of exclusion within the governance system. It's as if we don't have rotation principle. It's as if we don't have power shift principle. It's as if we don't have federal character principle. Yet all of those things are there. And so when it comes to exclusion, you can see even what has happened with the educational system. I was thinking that probably they will create centers where government people will live and they import intelligence and police and soldiers to guard them so that they will be free from the insecurity that we suffer, just as their children have access to foreign universities as they've shut down our own universities. But they have seen that exclusive practices will do nobody no good in the long run. At the end of the day, all the, what do we call them, the apparatus of police that they, personalize. They have all kinds of military escorts and all of that. They've seen now that the security situation has worsened. They cannot escape. Even the president has been threatened that he will be kidnapped, including the governor. That's the tragedy of disregard for inclusion. Then go to the educational sector when we talk about inclusion. Of course, we also see that the number of people whose children are in public university quite outnumber those who are in private universities. And you also find that significant amount of Nigerians, in fact, the so-called privileged Nigerians, can sponsor their children education abroad. And so the NLC and other unions have said, if they don't have interest in promoting public higher education, they are also going to join in supporting, in solidarity with the academic staff. So in other words, Nigeria is not really short of measures to promote inclusive governance. We also see, they said they have school feeding program. They talk about over 238 billion in those programs. You ask yourself, where are the children? Where is the food? What is the quality of food they are giving to those children? And what is the situation of the school feeding program? They also talk about cash transfer. During the lockdown, we saw them, the amount of money they were. Yes, some people got it. The question is, there's no accountability. Tell us how many people have benefited. Demonstrate to us where those people are to be found and all of that. But accountability is very low. So you can't break the barriers of inclusive governance without responsible citizenship. And responsible citizenship that we are talking about is about people who are concerned about one another, that citizens, even before they become governors, before they become members of the National Assembly, recognize the fact that we have a common problem, we have a common fate, and that within the state system, whether as a container of security, but also as a means of service provisioning, we must recognize that the welfare of others is part of our own individual welfare. With that kind of mindset, when we are in government, then of course, we recognize that the purpose of government is not for self-aggrandizement, it's not for us and our families alone, it's for public service, so that we can enjoy social stability, we can enjoy peace, we can enjoy progress, and prosperity will be shared. It's only under this condition of inclusive governance that we can achieve the kind of country that we all desire. And this has been clearly stipulated in part 2 of the Constitution, which is the directive principle of state policy. So until we have responsible citizenship, citizens becoming governors and becoming president, occupying the legislative houses and the judicial part of the government, we are not likely to enjoy inclusive governance. And without inclusive governance, I tell you, we will continue to experience the kind of problems that we have, because social dislocation, poverty, underrepresentation, perception of discrimination and marginalization will breed crime, will breed the delegitimization of the state, and then we ultimately lead to conflict and crisis in governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for that beautiful presentation. It was very insightful. I'll call on Mr. Daniel Adiola to please take over the question and answer session. Mr. Daniel. So while we wait for Daniel, please, if you have any question, okay, Mr. Barrister Femi, you can proceed with your question. Barrister Femi.
Hello, Prof. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. It was very eye-opening. However, I just want to ask one or two questions, just in follow-up to your presentation. You talked about, I think, the farmer leaders and the conflicts in particularly the Middle Belt. I was just wondering if, can we say it's a problem of inclusion, in the sense that how the problem all started, looking at it from the pastoralists and the farmers, and though there are some justifications for other factors, right, which we can refer to as the banditry and other things, but looking at the problem, looking at it from the structural angle of how the conflict started itself, can you refer to that as a problem of inclusion? Maybe the pastoralists were not properly included in terms of redesigning of the solution whenever it comes to like providing solution to the clashes, often clashes that they do have. And if we say it's the problem of inclusion, what do you think we should do differently, or the government can do differently in addressing the issue of the farmer elders conflict in a more a novel way, a new thing that you think can be adopted now? Thank you.
Please, if you have any question, you can put in the chat box or you can raise your hand. Mr. Martin, you can ask a question. Mr. Martin, you can mute your mic and ask a question, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good afternoon all.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Remi Aiyede, my teacher. That was mind-blowing, that was explosive. However, I think this is important. This lecture, what Professor Aiyede did just now is what we need at the moment. I think the audience is limited. This is civic education firsthand. And Professor Remi Aiyede has taken out time to explain the Nigerian problem and the solution to it, which I think is not restructuring like we always say. We've done so much of constitutional revisionism up until the time Professor Remi Aiyede mentioned. And that takes me back to the issue of responsible citizenship he mentioned. And I will focus on the two states off-season elections we had recently, Ekiti and Osun State. We could see how irresponsible citizenship played out in Ekiti. And we could see how responsible citizenship played out in Osun State. So for us to achieve what we really want to in terms of governance and by way of changing the baton come 2023, this kind of forum is very good. I think the organizers of this program before the election should think about expanding it. We should take the social media forum to a kind of make this thing, because people need to know. Now votes count. There are reforms in INEC, just like Professor Remi Aiyede mentioned. At the polling unit now, it goes straight to INEC data, this thing based. So we need to educate citizens. If you collect 10,000 at the polling unit, you are mortgaging the next 4 years of your life. Then again, I would want to ask something, Professor Aiyede. Before you came in, Professor Lafenwa, Dr. Lafenwa made mention of restructuring. I know your position on restructuring, but do you think that the Nigerian situation as it is at the moment can be resolved by restructuring as people clamor for now, or the institutional reforms that we've had over time is sufficient? If really we want change, it can give us the change we need? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Salawu, your question. So that will be after Mr. Salawu question. So Professor, you can answer the question, sir.
Okay.
So Mr. Salawu, your question. Hello, Mr. Salawu, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
but maybe it's having
Network issues.
because he has his hand raised, but or did he raise his hand by mistake? It's also possible.
Hello?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Now, time for the presentation so far, sir. My question goes thus. One, the issue of irresponsible citizen, which my earlier colleague made mention. From my own perspective, I think poverty, the rate of poverty in the country is one of the resultant effects is what we are experiencing in terms of irresponsible citizens. Nigerian citizens are hopeless due to the fact that their expectations are not always met, even considering the previous administration that they have experienced, thinking that change will eventually come and the likes. So I think the poverty that is facing the country now is what is responsible for citizens not being responsible, at least up into their expectation in terms of contributing to the inclusive governance. My own concern is now that what can we put in place that this poverty of a thing that has ruined the nation, the citizen, making them to become irresponsible, how can it be put in place, considering the different kind of economic reform that have already been put in place, which has not been materialized? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, let me start with the last question, the question of poverty and responsible citizenship. It's close to also talking about banditry, extremism, and all of that. They are often linked to poverty, but you know, one factor cannot explain critical issues like irresponsible citizenship. We must pay attention to that. For instance, we're discussing with an honorable member of the House, a former honorable member of the House of Representatives, and we told him that, look, why is it that it is now that they are talking about the impeachment of the president? And he says, look, it is not the problem of the members of the National Assembly, that given the crisis that is in the country, they would have expected Nigerians to be demonstrating, campaigning, or rising up against the government here and there all over the place. And I told him that, look, even the ASU that have been on strike for 5 months, the NSC that has joined them in demonstration and everything, what is the response from government? That it's easy, you know, to blame the victim. And that's actually the point that we must try to avoid. And that is why when I was discussing the analysis of undermining the rotation principle by people who argue that if the East wants the president, they have to work for it, they have to do this, they have to do that. And I said, look, if you want to say everybody has to work for it, so the poverty-stricken man, who I remember in Abeokuta, in Ekiti, Ado Ekiti, when I went there on electoral observation, we were looking for somewhere to eat and all of that. And then because most of the shops were shut, and then we saw some guys say, look, check that restaurant. Is it open? They say, yes, it is open. I said, are you sure? They say, yes. And then as we went there, we got there, they started begging us for money. See, I've not eaten since morning. Please, can you get us something to eat? And I said, look, if somebody who is meeting us a stranger, we are just asking for direction, can just jump on us and be asking that the person should not. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, please. There was an interference in my line. So I said, if people are so hungry that they are not sure of their next meal, how can you blame them for not selling their votes? Because, and that's the point that we are making, in places where poverty has become so deep-seated, government take positive action to help those who cannot help themselves. Because what we are saying, in fact, is that some people simply can't help themselves. They will be in poverty and extend the poverty to their children if nothing comes out from their environment to help them. And that's why even poverty studies will tell you about different types of poverty. There's structural poverty. There's temporary poverty. So people who are under structural poverty can't help themselves, and the government's responsibility is to bring them out of poverty. And if you don't have responsible leaders, they would rather take advantage of their poverty rather than help them or empower them out of poverty. And that's why responsible citizenship translates into responsible leadership and then translate in trying to create a responsible society. And we can go on to look at what we mean, for instance, by a responsible society, what we mean in detail by a responsible citizenship. A disempowered citizenship cannot be expected to be responsible at critical moments. And that's where government is important. Not only government, but those of us also who are privileged and have benefited from the system must also be responsible and recognize that even as we cry about our own disadvantage and marginalization, we must know that there are people who are worse off than us. And it is our responsibility, even as we fight for ourselves, to also fight for them. And I think that's the message I want to talk about concerning the whole idea of poverty and responsible citizenship. Then, of course, restructuring, institutional reform. You see, it's neither here nor there. Restructuring is an ongoing thing. There is no society that is not constantly under restructuring, because restructuring is like problem solving. When you encounter a problem, you have to take initiatives, policy changes in governance, rearrangement of powers between center and localities. Sometimes you give more power to the center. At other time, you reduce the power of the center. So restructuring is not one dimension. And that is why, even in the studies of state formation, we say state formation is an ongoing thing. No state is completely formed such that it doesn't have any problem again. It's a recent survey in the United States says 1 out of every 3 citizens thinks that either white citizens or something, but I can't remember exactly whether it's all citizens or just white citizens, says that the American government is ripe for overthrow through force of arms. So within the American system, whether it's Medicare they are talking about, whether it's even under Obama, 22 governors took the federal government to cut over Obamacare. So the whole idea is to define where the powers of the government should stop, federal government should stop, and where it should begin. So the whole idea of restructuring is an ongoing thing. It never ends because the processes of state formation never really end. So my own approach is to say, as a policy person, is take issues one after the other. If you want to address the issue of higher education, for instance, how do we deal with it? And what should the federal government do? What should the state government do concerning higher education? Right now, if you look at what is happening in the higher education sector, the whole idea of what the university should look like in Nigeria has come to grief, because it seems that if those in National Assembly think that once you are a member of the National Assembly, you are entitled to have a university in your constituency. Is that the goal of higher education? Because even higher education, there's a global market for higher education, and countries restructure their higher education system according to what they seek to achieve. And sometimes, for instance, in Canada, higher education has always been highly decentralized. But there are elements of, because they want to be globally competitive, the federal government had to begin to take initiative in the higher education sector. Until that time, the federal government has no role to play in higher education at all in Canada. If you go to Sweden, you also find the same changes, especially because they are, and Germany, that are part of the Bologna process, the European process, or idea of a common higher education market. The federal government has to intervene because the federal government is the international player on behalf of the country. And so he defines the policy vision of the university system in Germany. And so because of that, he begins to find one way or the other of interacting with the state, who are the originally sole players in higher education system in those countries. So you can't just come and be talking about restructuring in general. You must talk about a problem that you want to solve and the kind of changes and initiative you need to take in order to solve that particular problem. So when in solving that problem, some changes in the institutional or the structure of the
the country all over may happen. But it will be a byproduct of trying to solve a problem. Not that you restructure first, then you start saying, oh, has the problem been solved? No, it should be informed by problem-solving initiative. That's why when people say, oh, I ask them, okay, is the crisis in the university now, is it the result of the structure of Nigeria? So because you need to ask yourself, what exactly about the current structure is responsible for what problem? So the structure cannot be responsible for all problems the same way. So the demand of higher education in restructuring may contradict the demand for policing in restructuring. So that's my take on that. I'm not saying there should be no restructuring or there should be restructuring. I'm saying that restructuring should not be restructuring for its own sake. Restructuring must be the product of an attempt to solve specific problem, because that's only when we can connect specific problem with particular structure. So the whole idea of state formation or state development is an ongoing thing, and restructuring is an ongoing thing. But it must be founded on problems that we try to solve. So if you talk about security, for instance, some people just say state police. Nigeria is the only place where you have states without police. I say, is that how you solve the security problem? Look, secondary education has been with state government. Go and see what is happening in the secondary schools. People cannot run secondary schools effectively in many places. And thanks to state private initiative, many schools are without roofing sheets. In Oyo State, for instance, they are still doing exam now because the government could not release grants to the principals, to conduct exams. They had to postpone exams, and the students are still in school. And go and look at the quality of question papers and all of this things they are using, how they are managing, as if the state government is not endowed sufficiently to run the private public secondary schools that is under its control. So you now say, then even now, look at the Amotekun that they have set up. What kind of training have they been given? So it's not just, we have security problem, therefore state police. So if you have state police, how does it solve the problem? It's just to say that you have some people wearing uniform who say they are police of state government. How will they relate to the federal police? Or are you going to eliminate federal police and replace them with state police? Okay, if there's state police, there's federal police. So what kind of crime is state police going to police, and which kind of crime with federal police? If there's a conflict between state police and federal police, which one will have superiority? Is it not still the federal government? So that's why for those of us in the policy, public policy arena, we are a little bit more careful and circumspect with all these popular recommendations when it comes to restructuring, because they are not anchored on a clear understanding or description or the explanation of specific problems and how those problems should be resolved. And that's, for me, is the core of the matter, that if you are going to do institutional change, institutional reform, it must be geared towards solving. Look at how we have restructured discourse. The same thing, that kind of restructuring we are shouting about. I tell you, I was reading something in the conversation on the electricity sector in Ghana. They decentralize, they put private sector. They have more electricity generated than is consumed in Ghana. They said they have about 2.5 megawatts is the need of the entire Ghanaian society. But they are generating about 4,500 megawatts. Yet they cannot get constant electricity anymore because they have run into debt. In order for them, for private sector to generate electricity in that quantity, they gave them a guarantee market. Anything they generate must be paid for by the discos, whether they use it or not. So they were oversupplying and underusing and forcing people to pay for what has been supplied but has not been used. Now they say the huge debt in Ghana is connected to the debt of electricity, and they have a major electricity crisis in Ghana today. So that's why when you say restructuring, people just talk about restructuring as if it's not a complicated matter, as if it is not also riddled by politics. So you are restructuring now, and those who have power will begin to determine what they want, because in Ghana, it's politics that was driving some of the decisions that were taken. They were looking for money to run for elections. So you sponsor people to go into the electricity generation, you guarantee the market for paying for their listing, they bring the money back to politicians, they use to run election, and then the country is in debt. So that's my position, that these things are not as easy as they look. Yes, restructuring is good, but it must be designed to solve problems in a clear and open manner. And of course, restructuring, we must also try to make sure that the process is inclusive. So in the public interest also. Now, the farmer headers conflict, that, yes, it involves a lot of inclusion. In fact, the Honorable today was telling us an example about that Atisbo local government in Oyo State is not Atisbo, it's Atibo. That the Atisbo in the constitution was a typographical error. And that they now move to see if they can rectify that error by a member from the senatorial district. And when the person brought a bill to amend the constitution, to amend the name of that local government, the bill failed. And he said, you know why it failed? He said people who voted against the bill were not concerned about whether Atisbo's name is corrected or not. He said they were looking at the conflict in Jos North local government. That the people in Jos North local government, which is a contested local government in Plateau State, want that name Jos North to remain. Why those people who are traditional indigenous to that community in Jos North want the local government to be changed to an indigenous local name in that local government. And you know, that local government is contested by the Hausa settlers and the indigenous of those local governments. And so they were saying, if we approve the Atisbo, then we will have to also approve the change of Jos North local government. So because of that, they shut the process down. So in other words, what we are saying is that the problem of inclusion and the problem of exclusion, when it becomes conflictual, becomes even more difficult to address. And so the question then is, if you have pastoralists who are moving from place to place, they are here today when the pasture is green, and they are away when the pasture is no longer green. They are going elsewhere. And it gets to a point, as a lot of climate change, where they now leave the free pasture and encroach into people's farms to feed their herds, then you have a serious problem. And when you look at the headers of conflict, you now say, okay, how do you address this problem without an inclusive approach? By bringing the headers, by bringing the farmers, by bringing conciliators or third-party intervention people, by allowing a government that is even-handed. But once you have a government that is siding one party in the conflict, then you have that conflict being protracted. And in the case of this farmer, we know, of course, how complicated it has been. You know the whole question of Ruga, the whole question of colony, and all the rest. So without an inclusive approach, it's difficult to address that government. And then you need responsible leader, because you must always come to that point. You need a responsible leader who is committed to an inclusive and collective solution. Because, you know, sometimes in resolving conflict, somebody has to, in any case, people have been killed already. And once you have blood already spilled, you can't get those people back. How do you pacify those who have lost members of their community without creating an environment in which those who have killed have a chance to apologize, and those who have been victims have a chance to forgive? And that's why, if you look at the whole argument about Western approach to conflict resolution through the court and judicial process, and then the political, what we call the African approach, which Mandami talked greatly about, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, the Gakaka court system in Rwanda, then you begin to understand what we are talking about when we talk about the role of inclusion in conflict resolution. It's not just about justice in terms of who is responsible and the punishment that should be meted out to the person. It's also about reconciliation. It's about apology. It's about forgiveness. You know, these are integral part of the process of conflict resolution with inclusion. And we have not seen any serious or responsible leader taking that part in addressing some of these problems. Rather, people are talking with air of superiority. They are talking because they think they have advantage. And you know, as I always say, advantage don't last forever. That's why even when you're on top, you must consider the possibility of not being on top tomorrow. Because being on top is not something that can be guaranteed eternally. But more importantly, even the weak can cause some troubles. And that's why I always make an example of Mandela's leadership, that when he became president, 80% of society was Black, and the voting population, 80% was also controlled by the ANC. But when they wanted to make policy, they said they described their society as a rainbow community. They didn't say these white people have oppressed us so much, let's undermine them. Because it recognizes the fact that though these whites are few, they can cause trouble, they can cause harm. The same thing, you don't say, oh, because we are strong now, and we have somebody who can, when it is not our turn, we say it's our turn. And then we think we can rise up, bribe everybody, win the primary. We see the problem now. After winning majority, landslide victory in the delegate primary, to get a vice presidential candidate is a problem. How can you win 1,717 in a slightly over 2,000 number of delegates? And after that, you are having problems all over the country. Are the delegates not from all over the country? Did they give you their mandate? If they give you their mandate, why are they not seeing you through? So you can't cut your nose to spite your face and think that you get it easy. Inclusion has no alternative. And that's why up till this moment, even in the United States, they are reinterpreting the Constitution to say that first it was the civil rights movement that says we the people, or what do they say? We have this truth to be self-evident, that we are born with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, they are saying that principle must now operate, must now include everybody. But when they made that law, they were referring to only whites, not just like white male, privileged, tax-paying, wealthy white people. But the civil rights said, no, you have to extend this thing to the Black. And they are still fighting up to that. Now, the last time we have is Black Lives Matter, after an Obama has been president. So you can see even in the advanced countries that the struggle for restructuring, the struggle for inclusion is an ongoing thing. And we also see that you are wealthy does not necessarily guarantee inclusion under a neoliberal market economy, that efforts must be made by responsible leadership to extend prosperity to the underclass, to those who are disadvantaged. We must continuously break barriers, and you don't have to have benefited or be incorporated into the system and assume that because you and your family, you are okay, it doesn't matter. We know that until the last man have a sense of belonging, has a feeling of a sense of belonging or self-efficacy, or what Amartya Sen talked about, the capability of an individual citizen to make effective choices is achieved. You can't disregard inclusion. Otherwise, there will be no stability. Crime will be high, and no one will feel secure. And that's the argument that it's often made when they say the poor are so hungry that they can't sleep, and therefore the rich also cannot sleep because the poor are hungry. If the poor are restless, they will take it on the rich. So we should not allow, as Rousseau says, any man, any individual to be so poor that is willing to sell himself. That's the point, right from how many centuries ago, that no one should be so poor that he's willing to sell himself into slavery in order to survive. So when you talk about vote buying, that's what we are talking about. That some people have become so dispossessed, so hopeless within society, that in order to survive for the moment, if they have to sell their votes, they will. So for me, inclusion, there's no alternative than fighting for it, whether we are privileged or not. It is not until we become part of the underclass that we recognize the problem that is arising from exclusion from the good things of life by a significant number of citizens within our community.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for enlightening us and answering our questions. And it's great to know that in this struggle for inclusive governance, it's key for us to take it up ourselves, and we need to be responsible. And just like Mr. Martin has said, it's something that we need to start going among ourselves, need to ask ourselves, have this awareness among ourselves to ensure that we need to be responsible. We need to start taking actions so that inclusive governance we want to see, that inclusive governance, those principles that need to guide us to have an inclusive governance, we bring those principles back to play and ensure that we achieve this. So that will be the last question we'll be taking today. So we'll be rounding up the session. We are so thankful for each and every one of us that have been able to join since yesterday. So I'll hand over to Larry, who will round us up and just give us a brief thank yous for today. Back to you, Larry.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. On behalf of ApexGuide Development Center, I want to express our heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers. Yesterday we had Barrister Olufemi Adeniton, the Executive Director of Greenhouse Resource Center, and Professor Irene Pogosin, a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science, who also happened to be my undergraduate project supervisor. So it was a very insightful moment with our speakers yesterday. And then today again, the conference continued and we had Dr. Stephen Lafenwa, and he took us through the role of the states in inclusive governance. And then we have our amiable Professor Remi Aiyede, the head of Department of Political Science, University of Ibadan, and he has taken us through the role of responsible citizenship in inclusive governance. Overall, it has been a privilege and an honor to have this set of scholars with us today as we looked at the topic of inclusive governance. I would also like to express our profound gratitude to the moderators. We had Mr. Ayoko Samuel, who is also the president of the Association of Graduate Students of Political Science, University of Ibadan, and also one of us at ApexGuide Development Center. And I also want to appreciate Mr. Daniel Adiola, who is the program coordinator for ApexGuide Development Center. And he has been the one keeping in touch with our speakers and ensuring that everything goes on as planned. And I would also like to express our gratitude to our partners and supporters. In this regard, I would like to thank Liberty Watchtower, specifically Mr. Afis Adiatu, who is currently in Germany undertaking his master's program. Thank you very much for the support. And we also like to appreciate Greenhouse Resource Center. Greenhouse Resource Center is also a sister NGO in Nigeria that's also focused on social and community development. And lastly, I would like to express our profound gratitude to our participants. You guys have been a wonderful audience, and we are so happy to have you. And we hope to see you in our subsequent programs. And on that note, I would also like to inform us that in December this year, we're going to be having another conference, and more information on that will be coming up on our social media platforms. So I encourage everyone to please like our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter or follow us on Instagram to get updated with regards to our programs. And in case you are wondering who we are, ApexGuide Development Center is a non-governmental organization that seeks to promote good governance and democratic development in Nigeria. And this we hope to achieve through organizing periodic seminars, conferences, and workshops that provides the opportunity for civic education, advocacy, and discussing on issues of public policy, political participation, human rights, and so on. And for those who have been asking, the program both yesterday and today was recorded, and the video will be uploaded on YouTube and social media platforms. So you are going to have access to all of that. And so on this note, I'd like to bring the conference to an end. Thank you very much.